The man known as the Glacier, the frozen heart of the soul underworld, was on his knees, his tailored charcoal suit ruined by the black mud of a child-sized grave, shaking with the silent, jagged sobs of a man who had forgotten how to breathe. It was a sight that would have been unthinkable to anyone who had crossed Ji-hoon Kang and lived to tell of it. He was the architect of the syndicate's absolute rule, a ghost of a man who moved through the city like a winter storm, turning rivals to stone with a single, unblinking stare. Yet here, under the weeping sky of a forgotten cemetery, stripped of his bodyguards and his lethal dignity, he was nothing more than a father whose light had been snuffed out in a single, fiery accident. The mourners had long since departed, their black cars and performative grief vanishing into the soul smog, leaving him isolated with the cruel permanence of the headstone. The marble was white, pristine and mocking, bearing the name that had been his only source of warmth, Hana Kang. Below her name were the dates of a life that had barely begun, 7 years of laughter silenced by a jagged cliffside road and a car that had turned into a pyre. The scent of funeral lilies, thick and suffocating, clung to his skin like a shroud, reminding him that all the blood he had spilled to build his empire couldn't buy back a single second of her voice. Ji-hoon did not go back to his office. He did not return to the high-rise building where men trembled at the sound of his footsteps. Instead, he stayed by the dirt. Day after day, the Glacier sat in the mud until the sun went down and the city lights started to glow in the distance. He looked like a statue that had been forgotten by time. His phone stayed in his pocket, heavy and silent, filled with hundreds of missed calls from his captains and business partners. They were panicking. The docks were sitting empty, the money was moving into the wrong hands, and the streets were starting to whisper that the king was dead even if his heart was still beating. He didn't care about the money or the power anymore. To Ji-hoon, the gold and the ivory towers were just piles of ash. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Hana smile. He remembered the way she used to hold his pinky finger with her whole hand. He realized too late that he had spent all his time building a kingdom for a girl he rarely found the time to play with. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders until he could hardly stand up straight. Across the city, in a room filled with expensive cigar smoke and the clinking of ice, his enemies watched him through long-distance cameras. Chairman Ryu sat at the head of a long table, a cruel grin stretching across his face. He watched the grainy footage of the most dangerous man in Seoul sitting in the dirt, talking to a piece of stone. "Look at him," Ryu whispered to his followers, his voice full of mock pity. "The great Ji-hoon Kang has turned into a wet rag. He's soft. He's broken. He's crying over a ghost while we take his world away from him piece by piece." The other bosses laughed. They saw a man who had lost his edge, a predator who had forgotten how to bite. They began to move their men into his territory, stealing his shipping routes and bribing his guards. They thought the glacier had finally melted. They didn't realize that when ice melts, it doesn't just disappear, it becomes a flood that can drown everything in its path. Ji-hoon knew they were watching. He could feel their eyes on him, but he stayed still. He let them think he was weak. He let them believe the fire had gone out. He watched a small beetle crawl across the base of the headstone, wondering how something so small could be so alive while his daughter was gone. He reached out to touch the cold marble, his fingers raw from the cold rain, and whispered a promise he had failed to keep while she was alive. The empire was falling apart around him, but in his mind there was only the silence of the grave. The night air grew cold, and a thick fog began to crawl over the cemetery grass. Ji-hoon sat in the dark, his body stiff like the stone behind him. The world was quiet, except for the distant sound of city traffic and the wind blowing through the dead leaves. He felt like he was part of the earth now, a man made of shadows and old regrets. But then, a sudden vibration against his leg made him jump. It was a sharp, buzzing sound that didn't belong in a place for the dead. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen was cracked, but the light was so bright it made his tired eyes sting. He expected to see another angry message from his captains, or a mocking text from a rival. Instead, the screen was mostly blank. In the center of the glass, a small green dot was blinking. It was a GPS signal. Ji-hoon's heart missed a beat. He knew that specific green light. It was the tracking signal for the custom locket he had given Hana on her last birthday. He had been told the locket was destroyed in the fire. He had been told it was melted into nothing at the bottom of a cliff. Yet, here it was, pulsing with life. His hands began to shake. The green dot was not at the bottom of a cliff. It was moving. It was miles away, deep in the industrial heart of the city, hidden somewhere in a maze of old warehouses. Ji-hoon stared at the screen, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. He told himself it was a mistake. He told himself it was a cruel trick played by his enemies to drive him truly mad. But then, a small audio file appeared below the map. The sender was unknown. The file was only 3 seconds long. With a finger that trembled, he pressed play. At first, there was only static, the sound of a fan humming in the background, and a faint metallic clinking. Then, he heard it. It was soft, but to Ji-hoon it sounded louder than a physical explosion. It was the sound of a child breathing. It was a rhythmic, shaky sound, followed by a tiny, muffled sniffle that he would recognize anywhere in the world. It was Hana. The glacier did not melt. He cracked. The heavy grief of that had filled his brain for weeks suddenly cleared, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He stood up, his joints popping, his tall frame cutting through the mist like a blade. The man who had been sitting in the mud, waiting for his own life to end, was gone. In his place stood the most dangerous predator in Seoul, and he finally had a scent to follow. He didn't look back at the grave as he walked toward his car. He didn't need the stone anymore. He looked down at the blinking green dot on his phone and felt a dark, powerful energy return to his limbs. If Hana was breathing, then anyone standing between him and that signal was already dead. The sky finally broke, and a heavy rain began to pour down, turning the cemetery into a world of splashing water and mud. Ji-hoon did not leave. He did not call for help. He drove his car to a small shed near the back of the graveyard and kicked the door open. He grabbed a heavy metal shovel, his grip so tight that his knuckles turned white. The thunder rolled above him like the sound of war drums, but Ji-hoon didn't blink. He walked back to the spot where the white marble stood and pushed the shovel into the earth. He worked with a strength that didn't seem human. Every time he threw a pile of wet dirt over his shoulder, he pictured the blinking green dot on his phone. The rain soaked through his expensive suit, making it heavy and cold, but he didn't feel the chill. His lungs burned and his muscles screamed, but he kept digging. He had to know. If the signal was real, then the body he had buried weeks ago was a lie. The thought made his blood boil, pushing him to move faster as the hole grew deeper. Finally, the metal of his shovel hit something hard with a loud thud. Ji-hoon dropped to his knees in the mud, using his bare hands to clear the rest of the dirt away. His fingernails bled as he clawed at the wood of the casket. He reached for the heavy lid and pulled it open with a roar of effort. He expected to see his daughter's favorite dress. He expected to feel the crushing weight of her loss one last time. Instead, he found nothing but rough, heavy burlap. Ji-hoon reached into the dark box and pulled out a long, heavy sandbag. Then another. He threw them onto the muddy grass, his eyes wide with shock. The casket was filled with nothing but weight and shadow. There was no girl. There had never been a body. The funeral, the tears, and the weeks of sitting in the rain had all been for a box of dirt. The enemies he had trusted to handle the accident had treated his daughter like a piece of trash to be swapped for stones. The sadness that had held him down for so long suddenly snapped. In its place came a white-hot rage that felt like fire in his veins. He looked up at the dark clouds, the rain washing the mud from his face, but his eyes stayed dark and cold. He realized now that they hadn't just taken his daughter, they had mocked his heart. They had watched him weep over sand and laughed behind his back. Ji-hoon stood up in the open grave, his tall shadow stretching across the cemetery. The glacier was gone, replaced by a monster that was no longer afraid of the dark. He didn't care about the laws or the rules of the city anymore. He gripped the shovel until the wood creaked. Whoever had put those sandbags in that box had signed their own death warrant. He climbed out of the hole, his mind already spinning with a list of names. The hunt had officially begun. The next morning, the city of Seoul woke up to a shocking story. News cameras filmed the empty cemetery, showing the deep open hole and Ji-hoon's expensive car left running nearby with the door wide open. People whispered that the glacier had finally lost his mind. When his shoes were found near the edge of the Han River, the police and the gangs all came to the same conclusion. They believed Ji-hoon Kang had jumped into the dark water, unable to live with his grief. His enemies celebrated, and his captain started fighting over his empty chair. To the rest of the world, Ji-hoon was just another ghost. But Ji-hoon was not under the water. He was in the shadows, moving through the city like a cold breeze that no one noticed. He had traded his tailored suit for a heavy black hoodie and a face mask. He stayed away from the bright lights in the main streets. He lived in a small, dusty basement that even his closest friends didn't know about. From the darkness, he began to watch the people who had stood at Hana's funeral. He remembered every face. He remembered who had cried too loudly and who had looked a little too happy. His first target was a man named Mr. Choi. He was a low-level manager who had been in charge of the accident scene. Ji-hoon waited until the man was walking alone to his car in a dark parking garage. Before Choi could even reach for his keys, a strong hand grabbed his throat and slammed him against the concrete wall. Choi looked into the dark hood and saw eyes that looked like frozen glass. He tried to scream, but the air wouldn't come. "I buried a box of sand, Choi," Ji-hoon whispered. His voice was low and scary, like the sound of ice cracking. "Where is my daughter?" Choi's face turned purple. He shook his head, his eyes wide with terror. He thought he was looking at a dead man come back for revenge. I don't know," he gasped out. "I was just told to clean the road. They told me the body was already gone." Ji-hoon didn't let go. He leaned in closer, his grip tightening. "Who told you? Give me a name, or you will find out what it's like to be buried alive for real." The man started to cry, his legs shaking. He spilled everything he knew. He spoke about secret meetings and bags of cash delivered by men in gray suits. Ji-hoon listened to every word, his mind recording every detail like a computer. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was a hunter. One by one, he checked the names off his list. He moved from one mourner to the next, leaving a trail of terrified men behind him. He was learning the truth, piece by painful piece. The world thought he was gone, but he was closer than ever. He was the monster under their beds, and he wouldn't stop until he found the path to the white room where his daughter was waiting. Hana sat on the edge of a small, narrow bed in a room that was perfectly white. The walls were white, the floor was white, and the bright lights on the ceiling never turned off. There were no windows to show her if it was day or night. To most 7-year-old girls, this place would have been a nightmare that made them cry until their throats were sore. But Hana was not like other girls. She sat very still, her small hands folded in her lap, counting the seconds in her head just like her father had shown her during their secret agent games. She remembered the way her father's voice sounded when he sat her down in his big office. He would tell her that a Kang never panics. He had taught her how to stay calm by solving puzzles and memorizing every detail of a room. "Everything is a map, Hana," he had told her. "You just have to find the lines." Hana looked at the heavy metal door. There was a small electronic keypad on the wall next to it. She closed her eyes and visualized the man who brought her food. She remembered the exact sound his fingers made when he tapped the code. Beep, boop, beep, beep. She knew it was 4 numbers. She had also noticed that he always wiped his thumb on his pants after touching the 4 and the 7 keys. She didn't have the strength to open the door yet, but she was collecting the pieces of the lock in her mind. Under her bed, she had hidden a small piece of metal she had found loose on a food tray. Every time the guards changed shifts, she used the metal to scratch a tiny mark on the underside of the bed frame. She was tracking the vibrations of the building. She could feel a deep, low hum every few hours, the sound of a subway train passing nearby. She counted the time between the hums. By matching the sounds to the memory of the city maps her father used to study, she was starting to figure out exactly where she was. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was a little detective. Sometimes her chest felt tight, and she wanted to call out for her daddy. She missed the way his scratchy suit felt against her cheek, but then she would touch the small charm on her wrist. The locket was gone, but she had managed to hide a tiny part of the chain in her sock. She knew her father was coming. He had told her once that if she ever got lost, she should stay in one place and leave a trail. She had left her heartbeat for him when she pressed the hidden button on her locket before they took it away. Now she just had to be brave. She squeezed her eyes shut and practiced her memory puzzles again, picturing the way home. She wasn't afraid of the white room anymore because she knew that out there in the dark, the glacier was moving. The rain returned to Seoul, falling in thin, cold needles that blurred the neon signs of the city. Ji-hoon stood in the shadows of a narrow alleyway, his breath forming a light mist in the air. He was waiting for the one person he still thought he could trust, his right-hand man, Sang-ho. They had grown up together in the streets. They had fought side by side to build the syndicate. Sang-ho was the only one who knew the secret codes to Ji-hoon's private safe and the exact route Hana took to school every morning. When the black car pulled into the alley, Ji-hoon didn't move. He watched Sang-ho step out, looking nervous, clutching a heavy leather bag. Sang-ho wasn't there to meet a friend. He was there to meet a messenger from Chairman Ryu. Ji-hoon watched from the darkness as Sang-ho traded a small USB drive for a stack of cash. The truth hit Ji-hoon harder than a physical punch to the stomach. It wasn't an enemy who had handed Hana over to the monsters. It was his brother. Ji-hoon stepped out of the shadows. The light from a flickering street lamp caught his face, making him look like a vengeful spirit. Sang-ho froze, the money bag slipping from his fingers and hitting the wet pavement with a heavy thud. His face turned as white as the lilies at the funeral.
Ji-hoon? Sang-ho whispered, his voice trembling. They told me you were dead. They told me you jumped. You sold her, Ji-hoon said. His voice was so quiet it was almost buried by the sound of the rain, but it was filled with a terrifying coldness. You knew how much she meant to me. You sat at my table and ate my bread while you planned to put her in a cage. Sang-ho began to stumble backward, his hands held out in front of him. It wasn't like that. Ryu said he wouldn't hurt her. He just wanted you to step down. He said it was the only way to have peace. I did it for the family, Ji-hoon. You don't mention family, Ji-hoon replied, taking a slow, steady step forward. You sold a child to a wolf because you wanted to be the new boss. You traded my daughter's life for a bag of paper. Sang-ho reached for a gun hidden in his jacket, but Ji-hoon was faster. The glacier moved like a flash of lightning. In one smooth motion, he closed the distance and disarmed his old friend. There were no loud shouts and no long speeches. The alley remained silent except for the splashing of water. Ji-hoon looked into Sang-ho's eyes, seeing the greed and the fear hidden there. The betrayal was a poison that had to be removed. Ji-hoon did what he had to do. It was a silent, professional end to a friendship that had lasted 20 years. When it was over, Ji-hoon stood alone in the rain, looking down at the man who had betrayed him. He didn't feel happy and he didn't feel proud. He only felt a deeper, colder emptiness. He picked up the USB drive that Sang-ho had dropped. On it was the final piece of the map, the location of Ryu's secret safe house. The Judas kiss was over. Now there was nothing left to hold the glacier back. Ji-hoon did not go straight to the warehouse. He knew that Chairman Ryu was like a spider who could feel even the smallest wiggle on his web. To get to Hana, Ji-hoon had to pull the spider out of its hole. He went back to his hidden basement and opened a heavy metal case. Inside were the keys to the secret parts of his empire that Sang-ho had never known about. He had enough money and loyal men in the shadows to start a fire that Ryu could not put out. One by one, Ryu's businesses began to crumble. In the middle of the night, 3 of Ryu's biggest cargo ships were blocked at the harbor. At the same time, the computer systems for Ryu's private banks crashed, erasing millions of dollars in seconds. Fires broke out in Ryu's empty warehouses across the city, lighting up the sky with orange flames. It looked like a war had started, but there was no army to fight, just a ghost striking from the dark. Inside his high-rise office, Chairman Ryu was pacing back and forth. His phones were ringing off the hook. Every minute, a new report came in about another loss. He was losing his money, his power, and his mind. He looked at the cameras, but all he saw was smoke and confusion. He began to sweat, his expensive silk shirt sticking to his back. He realized that the glacier wasn't dead. He was very much alive, and he was hunting. "He's coming for the girl," Ryu barked at his guards. "He thinks he can find her here. We need to move her now. Take her to the safe house by the old shipyard. It's a fortress. No one gets in or out without me knowing." This was exactly what Ji-hoon wanted. He was watching from a stolen van across the street, his eyes fixed on the black gate of the building. He saw the guards rushing around like panicked ants. He saw them bring out a small, hooded figure wrapped in a heavy coat. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was Hana. They bundled her into a silver SUV and sped away, followed by 2 cars full of armed men. Ji-hoon followed them, staying far back so they wouldn't see his headlights. He wasn't just following a car, he was following the trap he had set. By forcing Ryu to move her, Ji-hoon had made them leave the safety of their high-tech white room. They were out in the open now, moving toward a place where the shadows were deep and the city noise was loud. Ji-hoon checked his weapon one last time. His face was like stone, his mind focused on only one thing. The distractions were over. The games were finished. Ryu thought he was taking Hana to a safe place, but he was actually leading the glacier straight to his front door. The shipyard was a graveyard of rusted metal and rotting wood. Rain lashed against the corrugated iron walls of the main building, creating a roar that drowned out the sound of Ji-hoon's footsteps. He didn't sneak in. He didn't hide in the corners. He walked straight through the front gates, a lone shadow against the flickering yellow street lamps. The guards spotted him immediately and opened fire, the sound of gunshots echoing like thunder in the hollow space. Ji-hoon felt a sharp, hot sting in his shoulder as a bullet grazed his skin, but he didn't stop. He moved forward with a slow, steady pace that terrified the men watching him. He looked like a ghost that could not be killed. When the first group of guards rushed him, Ji-hoon fought with a silent, heavy fury. He took a shallow cut from a knife across his ribs, the blood soaking into his dark hoodie, but he didn't even flinch. He was no longer a man who felt pain. He was a father who had already spent weeks in hell, and now he was bringing that fire with him. Inside the warehouse, Ryu's elite soldiers scrambled to block his path. They threw everything they had at him. Ji-hoon was hit again, a bullet catching him in the thigh, making him stumble. He went down on one knee, his breath hitching in his chest. For a second, the guards thought they had won. They moved closer, guns raised, ready to finish the job. But then Ji-hoon looked up, and the cold light in his eyes made them freeze. He stood back up, using a rusted shipping crate for support, his face a mask of blood and grit. He was battered and broken. His left arm hung heavy at his side, and his breath came in ragged, painful gasps. But he didn't stop moving. He walked through the hail of lead and steel like a man who had already died and had nothing left to lose. The guards began to back away, their hands shaking as they reloaded. They weren't fighting a person anymore. They were fighting a force of nature. Every time they knocked him down, he rose again, his eyes fixed on the heavy metal door at the back of the room. "Get back!" Ryu screamed from the catwalk above, his voice high and thin with fear. "Kill him! Why won't he die?" Ji-hoon didn't answer. He reached the bottom of the stairs, his boots splashing in a mixture of rainwater and blood. He felt the weight of his injuries pulling at him, trying to drag him into the dark, but the memory of Hana's breathing on that 3-second audio file kept him standing. He was a man driven by a single, unbreakable purpose. He pushed through the final line of defense, his movements slow but unstoppable. To Ryu, it looked like hell itself was walking up those stairs. Ji-hoon reached the door and kicked it open with his last bit of strength. He didn't care about the wounds on his body or the blood on the floor. He was inside. The final room was quiet, a sharp contrast to the screams and the gunfire outside. Chairman Ryu stood in the corner, his back against a cold brick wall, holding a small pistol with hands that would not stop shaking. In the center of the room, sitting on a wooden chair with her hands tied behind her, was Hana. Her eyes were wide, but when she saw the blood-stained figure in the doorway, she didn't scream. She didn't look afraid. A small, bright light sparked in her eyes that had been dim for weeks.
"Drop it, Ryu," Ji-hoon said. His voice was a raspy whisper, his lungs struggling to pull in air. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, his clothes torn and his skin covered in the dark marks of battle. He looked like a man who had walked through a fire, but he held his ground. Ryu looked at Ji-hoon, then at the door, realizing his empire had vanished in a single night. He saw that Ji-hoon didn't care about the money, the docks, or the throne. He only saw a father who had come back from the dead. Ryu's courage broke like glass. He dropped the gun on the floor, fell to his knees, and covered his face with his hands, sobbing in terror. Ji-hoon didn't even look at him. He didn't waste his energy on a man who was already defeated. Ji-hoon stumbled forward, his legs shaking with every step. He reached Hana and fell to his knees beside her. With trembling fingers, he pulled a small knife from his belt and sliced through the ropes. The moment her hands were free, Hana threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his tattered hoodie. "Daddy!" she sobbed, her small body shaking against his chest. "I knew you would find me. I played the games. I stayed still." Ji-hoon tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The glacier, the man who had built a wall of ice around his heart to survive the cruel streets of Seoul, finally shattered. He wrapped his large, scarred arms around her, pulling her so close it felt like they were one person again. The coldness that had defined his life for years simply evaporated. He didn't think about the rivals he had crushed or the city he now controlled. He didn't care that he was bleeding or that his body was broken. As the first lights of the morning sun began to peek through the dirty warehouse windows, hitting the dusty floor in long golden stripes, Ji-hoon put his head on Hana's shoulder and wept. These were not the jagged, hopeless tears he had shed at the empty grave. These were tears of pure, overwhelming relief. He sat there on the floor, holding his daughter, as the sun climbed higher, warming the cold metal of the shipyard. The war was over. The glacier had melted away, leaving behind only a father who had finally found his way home. For the first time in his life, Ji-hoon Kang wasn't looking at the shadows. He was looking at the light, and he promised himself he would never let it go again.